It was just another routine stop, a quick fill-up at the gas station before the next shift. But for Malik, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The police officers who approached him weren't there for a simple conversation. In seconds, the world around him changed. His hands were pressed against the cold metal of his car, the harsh lights of squad cars illuminating the night, their flashing red and blue lights blurring his vision. The officers didn't listen to his questions. They didn't hear his protests. They didn't see him as a man, just another black body to control, to arrest, to humiliate. Malik wasn't one to back down, but tonight he was outnumbered, helpless. The officer's words were cutting, dismissive, threatening, and laced with years of ingrained prejudice. And when he was dragged to the police station, his only crime was existing in a world where his skin color made him a target. The next day, in a twist that no one could predict, the tables turned. Malik stood tall, not as a suspect, but as a judge. The very officers who had arrested him were now in his courtroom, trembling under the weight of their own ignorance. The world had shifted, and in that moment Malik understood one thing. Justice had a way of returning the favor. Malik had always been a man who believed in hard work, in earning everything he had. Growing up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and police encounters were frequent, he learned early to keep his head down, to move through life unnoticed. He had spent years working multiple jobs to get by, always striving for something more, something better. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't outrun the shadow of racial prejudice that seemed to follow him wherever he went. That night, as he stood with his hands pressed against the cold metal of his car, waiting for the officers to finish their routine check, the weight of it all hit him. It wasn't the first time he'd been stopped, but it was the first time he felt truly powerless. The officers weren't just looking at him. They were judging him, deciding who he was without knowing a single thing about him. Malik wasn't a criminal. He wasn't even a troublemaker. But to them, he was just another black man in a place they thought he didn't belong. The arrest was quick. They didn't listen to his explanations. They didn't care that he was a respected lawyer in the community, someone who had dedicated his life to justice. They simply saw the color of his skin and assumed the worst. His rights were ignored, his dignity stripped away. As they threw him into the back of the squad car, Malik's mind raced. How could this be happening again? How many times had he seen this play out for others? How many times had he heard the stories of injustice and thought, that could have been me? The ride to the station felt like an eternity, but the humiliation of the moment lingered far longer. He was processed, fingerprinted, and thrown into a holding cell. But something inside him refused to accept this as his reality. Malik knew he was more than what they saw. He was a product of his struggles, his achievements, and his relentless belief in the system. Until now. The night in jail felt like an eternity. He couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. His mind raced not with fear, but with clarity. He'd spent years fighting for what was right, trying to be the change he wanted to see in the world. But now, in this moment of vulnerability, he understood that real justice wasn't just about playing by the rules. It was about fighting for what was right, even when the system itself was broken. When the morning came and the sun's first rays hit the concrete streets, Malik felt a shift. He wasn't the same man who had been dragged into that holding cell the night before. He was stronger. He had been through hell, and now it was time to turn the tables. By the time he was released, a strange sense of peace washed over him. His phone had been flooded with messages, support from friends, fellow lawyers, even some who had once looked down on him. Everyone was shocked by the arrest, but Malik knew that this was only the beginning. The injustice had been done, but now it was time to use the law as the tool it was meant to be. The media had caught wind of the incident. Local news outlets were already reporting on the incident at the gas station, and social media was ablaze with speculation. Malik knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the message it sent to everyone who had ever been marginalized, targeted, or silenced. As he prepared to head to the courthouse that day, something unexpected happened. He received a call from the very officers who had arrested him requesting a hearing. They needed him. The system they thought they could control was now in his hands, and so the man who had been thrown into a holding cell the night before walked into the courtroom the next day, not as a victim, but as a judge. The very officers who had humiliated him were now facing the consequences of their own actions. The courtroom was filled with the usual hum of expectation, but to Malik, it felt different today. The air seemed heavier, charged with a tension he hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just another case to him. It wasn't the usual battle between right and wrong, justice and corruption. It was personal. Every inch of this room represented the very system that had failed him, and now he was standing at its center, in the very role he had once assumed was reserved for others. As Malik walked through the halls of the courthouse, a mixture of emotions swirled inside him. Anger, yes, but also determination. He could feel the weight of all those who had been silenced, all those who had been wronged simply because of their race. He thought of the countless people who had faced what he had, and the many who hadn't made it out. Their stories echoed in his mind. A relentless reminder that his fight was not just for himself, but for the broader injustice that still loomed over his community. He reached the courtroom door, pausing for a moment. This wasn't just a hearing, it was a reckoning. Malik was now in control, and he would make sure the officers who had humiliated him and others would face the consequences of their actions. It wasn't just about the law. It was about breaking the cycle of systemic oppression that had plagued his life and the lives of so many others. This was the moment for change. Inside the courtroom, the officers were already seated, their faces tense and defensive. The contrast between them and Malik was stark. They sat in their uniforms, trying to maintain an air of authority, but there was a nervousness in their eyes. They didn't know what to expect, and Malik could see it. Their usual sense of dominance was slipping away, replaced with a quiet realization that this wasn't going to be like the other cases they had handled. The power dynamic had shifted, and they were no longer in control. Malik took his seat, his robe draping across the chair as he surveyed the room. The room was packed, filled with reporters, lawyers, and people who had come to witness the unprecedented sight of a black man arrested by the very officers now facing him as a judge. The media buzzed with anticipation, and Malik could feel their eyes on him. He knew this wasn't just about his personal vendetta. It was a symbolic moment for everyone who had ever felt the weight of racial injustice in their lives. As the proceedings began, Malik's voice rang clear and steady. He outlined the facts of the arrest, detailing the police officers' actions, their disregard for his rights, and the humiliation he had endured. Each word was a calculated strike, each sentence carefully crafted to expose not just their mistakes, but the deeper systemic failures that allowed these abuses to continue unchecked. But it wasn't just about the facts. Malik's voice carried a weight of experience, an understanding of the racial dynamics that had shaped his life and the lives of so many others. As he questioned the officers, he did not do so as a man seeking revenge. He did it as a representative of all those who had been silenced, ignored, or wronged by the system. He made them confront the truth in ways they hadn't anticipated. As the officers began to respond, their defenses crumbled. They fumbled with their answers, their voices growing shaky as they realized they were no longer in control. They couldn't hide behind their badges or their training. They had to face the reality of their actions. For every word they spoke in defense, Malik countered with facts, with experience, with the weight of a history they couldn't escape. His calm, measured demeanor was in stark contrast to their growing panic. The tension in the room was palpable, and the more Malik spoke, the more the officers shrank in their seats. The once untouchable figures were now just ordinary men facing the consequences of their abuse of power. Their arrogance, their assumptions about their invincibility, were stripped away piece by piece. At one point, one of the officers tried to assert that they had acted in accordance with standard procedure, but Malik wasn't having it. He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Your procedure doesn't matter when you're violating someone's rights," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "Your procedure doesn't matter when you see a man as a threat simply because of the color of his skin. And it certainly doesn't matter when that man is you." The room fell silent. The impact of his words hung in the air, thick with emotion. Malik wasn't just speaking to them, he was speaking for every person who had ever been wronged by the system. And in that moment, it felt as though the walls of the courtroom were echoing with the voices of those who had come before him, those who had never had the chance to speak. As the hearing continued, the officers' defenses became increasingly weak. The evidence was too clear, their actions too blatant. The public's eyes were now fully focused on them, and they could no longer hide behind their authority. They were just men, exposed and vulnerable in a system they had once believed was invincible. And then, just as the proceedings were drawing to a close, Malik stood up and delivered his final statement. It wasn't just a ruling, it was a moment of clarity, a call for justice. "This isn't just about what happened to me," he said. "This is about what happens to everyone who is targeted, mistreated, and dehumanized because of their skin color. This is about holding people accountable for their actions. And this is about making sure that the system works for everyone, not just the powerful." The room sat in stunned silence. The officers, once so confident, now realized the gravity of the moment. Malik had not just overturned their authority, he had broken down the very system that had enabled their behavior. He had shown them that justice could be wielded by anyone, anywhere, if they had the courage to stand up and demand it. The courtroom was charged with an electricity that no one had expected. It was as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for the final judgment. The officers, who had once sat with pride and authority, now seemed small. The smugness that had marked their posture when they first walked in had dissolved, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Their fate was no longer in their hands. It was in Malik's. The room was filled with a sense of anticipation. This was more than a trial. This was a moment of reckoning. Malik, standing behind the bench, looked at the officers before him, their eyes no longer filled with confidence, but with uncertainty. He knew what had to be done. It wasn't just about holding them accountable for his wrongful arrest. It was about sending a message to the entire system. The system that, for far too long, had failed to hold people in power accountable for their abuses. Malik's voice was steady, but beneath it, there was a quiet fury. "You arrested me," he began, his eyes scanning the officers one by one. "Not because I was a threat, but because you saw me as someone you could control. You took my dignity, my rights, and my freedom without ever asking the simple question, who am I? You didn't see a man standing in front of you. You saw a black man, and you assumed you knew who I was. But I am more than your assumptions. I am more than what you wanted to see." There was a pause, a moment where the weight of his words settled over the room. The silence was deafening. The officers remained still, but Malik knew they were hearing him now. They had no choice. Malik stood tall, his presence commanding the room. He wasn't just the judge anymore. He was a man who had taken control of his own narrative, who had faced down injustice and was now demanding it be addressed. His words carried not just his own pain, but the pain of everyone who had been wrongly accused, silenced, and ignored. They carried the weight of centuries of racial injustice. As Malik continued, his words became sharper, more focused. "You were taught to see me as a criminal. You were trained to act with authority, but you weren't taught to see the humanity in me, to see me as an equal. You were taught to enforce the law, but not to respect it. You mistook your power for righteousness. But today, you will learn that power can be dismantled. Today, you will understand what real justice looks like." The room was still. No one spoke. The officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, knowing that the judgment was coming. They could no longer rely on their badges, their training, or their assumed superiority. Malik had taken their power away with nothing but the truth. The climax of this moment was not in the words he spoke, but in the transformation of the room itself. The officers who had once been in control now found themselves powerless. The audience, who had watched from the sidelines, now understood the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just a trial, it was a message. A message that racism, prejudice, and abuse of power could no longer be ignored. That those who had been invisible would no longer remain silent. Malik's final words were simple, but they were the ones that would echo long after the courtroom had emptied. "You will answer for your actions, not just in this courtroom, but in the world outside. The law is meant to protect us all, but it can only do so when we hold each other accountable. Today, I am holding you accountable." As he spoke, the officers' faces fell. They had no more defenses, no more excuses. They could not deny the truth of what Malik had said. They were no longer the enforcers of the law. They were the ones who had violated it. With the final gavel, Malik made his ruling. The officers were found guilty of misconduct. The justice system had worked this time. And it wasn't just a victory for Malik. It was a victory for everyone who had been wronged, everyone who had suffered under the weight of systemic injustice. As the courtroom emptied, Malik stood behind the bench, feeling the weight of the moment. This was more than a legal victory. This was a moment of change, a moment where the system had shifted, if only slightly. He had proven that justice could still be served, even when the odds were stacked against him. He had shown the world that the system could be challenged and that it could be changed. As the doors closed behind the last of the officers, Malik allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The fight wasn't over, but this was a step forward, the first of many. And for the first time in his life, Malik felt a sense of peace. He had done what needed to be done. He had fought not for revenge, but for justice. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The courtroom doors closed behind Malik as the last of the officers left, their heads down, their expressions no longer filled with arrogance or pride. The hum of the city outside was faint, almost distant compared to the heavy silence that lingered in the air. Malik stood behind the bench, feeling a strange sense of peace, but also a profound realization. The case was over, but the fight was far from finished. As he walked out of the courtroom, his mind replayed the events of the day. The faces of the officers, the reactions from the courtroom audience, the moment he had stood there and made the ruling, it all felt surreal. But beneath it all, Malik knew this moment wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who had been silenced, ignored, or wronged by the same system. It was about the people who had never had the opportunity to stand at the bench, never had the power to turn the tables the way he had. Malik had always believed in the justice system, but he knew now that true justice didn't always come from following the rules, it came from challenging them when they were broken. And today, he had done just that. But the victory didn't feel like an end. It felt like the beginning of something much bigger. The media had already picked up the story. Headlines buzzed with shock and awe, capturing the unprecedented sight of a black man who had been arrested by the very officers he was now presiding over. His story was being shared across social platforms, news outlets were clamoring for interviews, and the country was watching. But Malik wasn't interested in the fame. He wasn't even interested in the applause. What mattered to him was the message that justice was not just about winning in the courtroom. It was about demanding accountability, about standing up when the system failed, and about making sure that every person was treated equally, no matter their race, background, or status. Back at home, Malik sat quietly at his kitchen table, the weight of the day settling in. His phone rang with messages from friends, colleagues, and family, all offering congratulations and praise. But it was his grandmother's message that hit him the hardest. "You've done something that will last, Malik. Not just for you, but for all of us. You've shown us that our voices matter." Her words echoed in his mind. It was a reminder that this victory wasn't just about one man or one case. It was about all the lives that had been affected by racial injustice, all the voices that had been silenced over the years. Malik realized then that his actions, no matter how small they seemed in the grand scheme of things, had sparked something much bigger. He had taken a stand, and in doing so, he had ignited a conversation that needed to be had, one that challenged the very foundation of the system that had oppressed so many for so long. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Malik's story continued to spread, inspiring others to speak up, to demand accountability, and to fight for justice in their own communities. His courtroom victory had become a symbol of change, a beacon of hope for those who had been marginalized or mistreated by the system. And though Malik never sought to be a symbol, he knew that the eyes of the world were now on him, watching, waiting to see what would come next. But Malik wasn't interested in fame or recognition. What mattered was that change had begun, And it was happening because people like him, people who had been overlooked, undervalued, and underestimated, had finally been given a platform to stand on. And when they stood together, the system could no longer ignore them. One night, as Malik walked through his neighborhood, he saw a group of young men gathered on the corner. They waved at him, smiles breaking out across their faces when they recognized him. "Hey, Malik, we saw you on TV," one of them called out. Malik smiled back, nodding his head. "Yeah, I guess that was me," he said. "But it's not about me. It's about all of us." The young men nodded, their eyes filled with a mixture of respect and hope. Malik had become more than just a judge to them. He had become a symbol of what was possible when you refused to stay silent, when you fought for what was right, even in the face of overwhelming odds. And as Malik continued his walk, he felt a sense of peace. He had done what he could, and he had made a difference. Justice wasn't just a legal concept. It was a way of living, a way of fighting for what was right, no matter the cost. Malik had learned that the hard way, and now he was ready to continue the fight. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and he knew there were many battles ahead. But for the first time, he truly believed that change was possible.